Hello and welcome to this discussion on open science. What is our sector telling us about the transition? I'm Susie Winter, Vice President of External Communications at Springer Nature. As many of you will know, Springer Nature has long been an advocate for an active voice in the transition to open access. Springer was the first publisher to offer authors an OA choice on its subscription journals, and BMC led the way as the first commercial OA publisher. We have a long-standing heritage in publishing fully OA journals, with our journals and imprints playing a key role in developing industry standards and policies for open access and research. Last year, we were proud to become the first to publish over 1 million OA articles, making them immediately available for all to use and reuse from the moment of publication. Now, our commitment to OA is not only rooted in a core belief in making research as accessible as possible as early as possible, but because we know from research we've undertaken that research published OA is used more and downloaded more, therefore providing authors with a real, definite and tangible OA advantage. But we are fully aware that open access is only part of the story, and we need to transition beyond that to open science. Now that's because it is only by opening up all aspects of research, so including data, code, protocols, methods, early versions of research via preprints, etc., and of course the final published version of record, that we can realise that prize of a faster and more effective research system. So really delivering solutions to the world's urgent challenges, whether that be vaccines against new viruses, as we saw during the pandemic, or tools to tackle other global challenges such as climate change. While we know that researchers broadly support open science practices, we are as yet to see this really translated into actual adoption. So we were keen to understand why. And so therefore I'm delighted to be joined by Chloe O'Donnell from our market intelligence team, who's really been exploring this exact question. So Chloe, over to you.
Thanks, Susie. So we've been looking at this growing appetite for open science, especially since the COVID-19 pandemic, which has seen some open science movement in particular fields, as well as demonstrating the benefits of those researchers who embraced open science during the pandemic. And as a publisher, we've been considering what this means for the future of scholarly communications. So numerous pieces of research indicate that the majority of researchers support open science as a whole, or specific practices that comprise open science. And I've referred to this as the philosophical buy-in. So they believe in the principles, they agree that open science practices should be commonplace. They believe in the principles and the benefits of open science, such as accessibility, transparency, integrity, and reproducibility, to help with addressing what's known as the reproducibility crisis, and reducing waste in research in terms of avoiding duplication of effort. And a large proportion of researchers have said that they think that open science benefits themselves as researchers, their field, and even society as a whole. But as you mentioned, buy-in to the principles of open science doesn't necessarily translate to buy-in to the practice of it. So again, our internal and external research shows that the extent of buy-in to open science as a whole and specific open science practices isn't reflected in the prevalence at which these open science practices are carried out. And this disparity between open science in principle versus open science in practice has significant implications for the future of open science in scholarly communications. As a result, we set out to find out how open Springer Nature journal authors are, focusing on the activities that they carried out last year. So we developed a survey to quantify the prevalence of various open science practices by Springer Nature authors in 2021. And we did this by inviting researchers who's published a research article in one of our journals last year, specifically the lead authors, so that we'd have one response per article and associated research project. And on inviting the authors, we didn't actually explicitly include phrases like open science or open research, as we didn't want to risk biasing the survey sample with a self-selecting cohort who are more familiar with open science and would thus skew the results. So we needed to recruit a representative sample of authors, which would include those who are not engaged with or aware of open science for whatever reason, in order to helpfully look into this phenomenon. We asked them about the open science practices that they carried out, if any, alongside their research project and the associated research article that they'd published with us. And we also asked them why they engaged in the activities that they did to identify what we refer to as the drivers of open science, and we asked them why they didn't engage, if they didn't, to identify what we refer to as the barriers of open science. At the end of the 2-week period in which the survey was open, 2,489 invited authors completed the entire survey. So now I'll go on to the hopefully good bit, looking at some of the things that we found. So if excluding gold open access publishing from the open science criteria, just under 2/3 of our journal authors self-reportedly practiced at least one of the 5 open science practices that we looked at in the survey, and they practiced that at least once in 2021. And if we include gold open access publishing in that open science criteria, that proportion jumps up to 83% of the sample. And overall, of those that did practice open science, an average of 2 of the practices that we looked at were carried out. So onto the actual practices that they engaged with. This is focusing specifically on the activities that they carried out alongside their most recent Springer Nature article and the associated research project. 44% of the sample published their article via gold open access in one of our fully open access or hybrid journals last year, which was close to the proportion of Springer Nature's actual open access publications. And this makes gold open access the most practiced open activity with regards to Springer Nature published research. At joint second, we've got open data or open materials and or code, which were grouped together, where just under 1/3 practiced that alongside their published article respectively. In third place, around 1 in 5 deposited a preprint of the manuscript before or during submission to Springer Nature Journal. And then finally, we've got pre-registration or the peer-reviewed form, registered reports, which were the least practiced, with just 16% practicing it for the research project associated with their Springer Nature Journal publication. And when we look at the other activities that they carried out with the research articles that they may have published in 2021 as a whole, we see the same trend, with open data and open materials and code coming in second place, followed fairly closely by preprints and pre-registration and registered reports in last place. One interesting trend that I found in the data was that open data, open materials and or code and preprints are significantly more likely to be practiced by authors who'd published at least one of their research articles via the gold open access model last year. There wasn't a trend for pre-registration or registered reports. And I do obviously want to note that gold open access and open science practice are not mutually inclusive or always paired with each other. We can see on this graph, for example, that the practice can and does occur exclusive of each other. But there is this significant positive trend between gold OA article publishing and open science practicing. And there are multiple reasons that could be underlying this positive relationship. For example, mutual philosophical drivers to open research as a whole. Those believing that articles should be openly accessible, we found are more likely to believe that other research output should be openly accessible. There are greater open science requirements or encouraging policies at open journals. For example, some of our journals require the associated research data to be shared where possible. And finally, mandates or encouragement from funders or institutions, which can extend beyond just the research article and into other practices such as data sharing. But as I said, the proportion of authors who say that they support open science is nonetheless much greater than the proportion actually practicing open science. And we've seen this disparity between buy-in and practice in both our own research and in externally published research. So to investigate this disparity in a reduced uptake of open science practices, we looked at the barriers to practicing open science. A couple of the barriers are not specific to a practice and are shared across them. So on this page I've just taken two of the answers that were provided across all of the open science practices that we asked about in the survey in a multiple choice question, when we asked those who didn't practice a certain activity why they didn't. And one of these is lack of awareness. This was actually the greatest barrier of all, applying to about half to a third of the non-practicing sample, depending on the practice. It was particularly great for preventing pre-registration or registered reports, with about half of those that didn't practice that saying that it was because they simply just weren't aware of the practice or didn't really know much about it. The second most prevalent barrier selected by authors across the practices was simply "I do not feel the need to," indicating that these practices are not front of mind for around 1 in 5 authors. And these authors likely lack internal motivations or external motivations to engage in the activities, such as receiving credit as part of research assessment, or it being commonplace or expected in their field of research. Moving on briefly to the barriers that are specific to individual open science practices. So for pre-registration registered reports, as I mentioned, the least practiced of all of these that we measured. After a lack of awareness and not feeling the need to carry out pre-registration, the third major reason is limited adoption of pre-registration in the author's field or industry, and a perception that this practice is not applicable outside of clinical trials. And that's unsurprising, given that subject area was really the main demographic determinant of whether authors practice this or not, with health sciences authors being twice as likely to have practiced pre-registration or registered reports compared to other authors in our sample. Moving on to open materials or open code. Uncertainty regarding permissions was another key issue here, preventing authors from practicing. So around 16% were unsure whether they had permission from their funder or institution to openly share their research, materials or code. Around another 16% were unsure about permissions specifically relating to intellectual property, such as copyright and licensing. And on the theme of sort of a lack of awareness, outside of general awareness of the existence of the practice itself, 15% did not feel sufficiently aware about the practical or technical aspect of open materials or open code. So saying that they are aware of it, but they don't know how to make their materials or code openly available, even if they are driven to do so. And this is quite a similar picture for open data. So again, outside of that general awareness of the practice itself, 17% didn't feel that they knew how to make their research openly available. For example, knowing which repository to use or what formatting to use. 16% were concerned about issues relating to privacy or ethics, especially for data that contains sensitive information or participant permissions before sharing. And 13% were again unsure whether they had permission from their funder or institution, and another 13% said they were unsure about, again, permissions specifically regarding intellectual property, such as copyright and data licensing. So again, this lack of awareness in terms of permissions or the technical aspect is a key barrier for some of these practices. Finally, on to preprints. Almost a third did not wish to share their research findings before peer review, particularly concerned about whether this would be perceived as less robust, or maybe it might highlight errors or key revisions in the revised article if someone were to compare the preprint to the final published article. And 16% also reported that preprints are not widely used in their field, just like pre-registration. So there's this sort of discipline-specific norms as well that are influencing authors' uptake or engagement with open science practices. And that really leads us on to a key question, which is what can be done to increase open science practices if we want the level of open science practice to meet the current level of philosophical buy-in to open science practice. So again, there are shared drivers between the open science practices, just as there were shared barriers. And I won't go into those specific drivers for individual practices today. I just wanted to briefly look at the ones that are shared. So we can see mandates, particularly funder mandates, have a limited role, according to authors, in driving their practice to open science. So these are responses from authors who practiced each respective open science activity, and only the minority really say that it was due to funder mandates, and the same is true for funder encouragement. Comparatively, institutional or organisational encouragement has a relatively greater success. I do want to note that this isn't a measure of the prevalence of mandates or encouragements from institutions or funders. This is just authors' self-reported drivers for practicing. Finally, we have the role of the journal. So where applicable, journal requirements, such as for open materials or open data, or journal encouragement, particularly with preprints, help drive the practice to the same or greater degree, according to authors, as institutional or organisational encouragement. So while mandates or encouragement by institutions or funders can and definitely do help drive authors to practice, we can see that journal publishers actually are playing a role, an important role at that, in driving open science, particularly with the open sharing of the inputs and outputs related to the research projects that they're publishing results for.
Gosh, Chloe, thank you. That's an incredibly comprehensive and fascinating piece of research that you've undertaken there. A few things really came to mind as you were going through that. I found the spike and the increase, particularly in preprints, around being a driver if the journal encourages it or makes it easy, and that's it struck me because that's really borne out in the work that we've been doing within Review, obviously a Springer Nature initiative to really help authors automatically and easily deposit their submission as a preprint. So that seems to be something that a real tangible benefit that a publisher can bring to the table here. Would that be true?
Yeah, the data definitely suggests that. So 23%, or almost 1 in 4, of the authors who deposited a preprint version of the article that they published in a Springer Nature journal said that they did so specifically because the Springer Nature journal encouraged or helped them to do so, for example with these initiatives like Review, which makes it easy for the authors, especially those that have never preprinted before. And we did also have a survey that we did earlier in the year with authors who were invited to use in Review, and the majority said they opted in because it looked easy to do so, and 1 in 2 actually said that it was because it was endorsed by Springer Nature, and around 3 in 4 said that they would use in Review again if it was available to them. So we are seeing that publishers can and definitely do play a role in encouraging open science activities and making them accessible, in particular to those who that practice is new to.
Great. So the other thing that seems to come really clear is also, so there are clearly things that publishers can do to help drive uptake. But I think your research pulled out that funders and institutions also have a big role to play in driving uptake of these practices, and that sort of, in embedding policy into the research process that encourages this seems to be quite key on this. Are there any other findings that we can take from that?
Definitely, we have seen that those who report having funder requirements or encouragement are more likely to be aware of open science practices in the first place. And there's external research also that shows that there's a positive relationship between obviously being mandated, belief in sort of the philosophy of open science, and practice. One of the key things that we do see though is the need for funders to provide, or institutions to maybe provide training to increase that compliance, to help address some of those barriers where authors are saying that they are not sure about things like permission, and where applicable, providing funding.
Wonderful. So if I had to summarise, there's a lot to be done about raising awareness, a lot that needs to be done around education. Yes, there are things that publishers can do, and at Springer Nature I'm really pleased that we are doing, but I think there's obviously more work to do there as well. And the fact that actually this is only going to achieve as a partnership with publishers, authors, funders, institutions working together to really achieve that open science vision that we know from the research, and actually that was played out during the pandemic, is actually going to deliver that much more faster, more effective, more open research ecosystem. Chloe, thank you so much. We could carry on, but I think that's given hopefully people a really good overview of that gap and what we can all do together to close it. Thanks so much indeed.
Thank you.